advantage of it, or are we going to complain and to sulk and essentially to fall behind? So you can look around and say, you know, is change inevitable? Is it really that big a deal? And I think what you want to do, I was talking to our kids about this last night, and I said, you know Kodak? And our two children, our oldest is a freshman now at Boston College, but the two kids still in the house said, never heard of Kodak. It's amazing that at a time in the history of humanity when more pictures are taken than ever, the company that had a monopoly on the market 10 years ago, Kodak, is out of business. It's unbelievable. They didn't act. They didn't take change. Remember Blockbuster? Used to go down to the local strip mall and go, you know, rent the DVDs. Gone. You ever heard of a company called Netflix? I mean, they weren't around really, and it came around 10 years ago. Remember they were doing the DVD by mail. In 2010, 6 years ago, they started streaming. They went into Canada. Now they're in 190 countries around the world. Netflix took the steps necessary amidst all this change, and they've been hugely successful, and Blockbuster's gone. And the list goes on and on. And when I look around, you know, Father mentioned my dad, and the people that I admired most in the political arena are ones that saw change as inevitable, saw change every day, not as a challenge, but as an opportunity, saw it as a challenge and saw it as an opportunity to help the powerless and the folks that don't have a voice. So I want to tell you just a couple quick stories, and then I'll be quiet, I promise, John. But I just finished a chapter of a book of famous Irish immigrants. I finished a book on Pope Francis a couple of months ago, and then wrote a chapter on a book on Father Flanagan, who was from Ireland, came here to study to become a priest, dropped out of the priesthood because he was sick, went a second time and dropped out again because he got sick, went back a third time, became a priest, went to Omaha, Nebraska to be near his brother who was also a priest, and then in the early 20s realized that there were so many young children that were suffering. And he started something at a boarding house for young kids. Went to the bishop, you'll appreciate this one, Father, asked about the idea. The bishop said, go ahead, you can try, but we're not giving you any money. So he went out and borrowed money, actually got a grant from a Jewish fellow in Omaha, Nebraska, opened the first home and allowed African American kids and white kids to live together. So think about that in the 20s, in segregated Omaha, Nebraska, segregated America. A Catholic priest from Ireland with a heavy Irish brogue took money from a Jew and started a house for boys and allowed African Americans and white kids in there at the same time. And he was attacked by the Omaha City Council, and he had a great retort, and I love this line. And he said, can you tell me what color a soul is? And that kept him going. He went to Ireland a few years later when he became quite well known here in America. And he went around Ireland and criticized the way the Irish government was dealing with young children in that country. And he was attacked in Ireland. 40 years later, the Irish government apologized and took steps to try to deal with the issue of poor children in that country, because they realized that what Father Flanagan said in the early 40s was absolutely correct. Father Flanagan started Boys Town. Remember that famous line, he ain't heavy, Father, he's my brother. That's him. He attacked President Roosevelt, who was a friend of his, and criticized him for the way he treated Japanese Americans in the internment camps in World War II. And President Truman, after the war, asked him to go around Europe and then into Asia to try to help the United States government deal with the issue of children and how they were being treated in post-World War II world. He was probably the most important and influential advocate, child advocate on the rights of behalf of kids in America. Father Flanagan, who was attacked and criticized in his home country, who was attacked and criticized in his home city, in his home state, and ultimately in his home country in America. But he persevered. I'll tell you one more quick story. My father, who Father Creed mentioned, worked and started the Civil Rights Unit on then Senator Kennedy's campaign in 1960. And Senator Kennedy was told that if he said anything positive about Khrushchev, Castro, or King, Khrushchev, Castro, or King, in the 1960 election, the Southern governors would throw their support behind Richard Nixon, then the vice president. And as some of you may know and recall, Martin Luther King was arrested a couple of weeks before the 1960 election, thrown in jail. And my father thought that it would be a good idea for Senator Kennedy to call Coretta Scott King to express his concern for her. My dad had grown up in Maryland. Half his family fought on the Civil War side, half fought on, fought on the southern side, and half fought on the northern side. His grandfather, 16-year-old kid, took Jeb Stuart to the Battle of Gettysburg, so he understood the Civil War. 16-year-old kid was his grandpa. So he asked, he thought, I think that if Kennedy made the call to Coretta Scott King, it would start to heal some of the wounds just 100 years after the Civil War. And he was told no. So he persevered, as father said, seeking, knocking, and waited a couple days until Jack Kennedy was in a hotel room in Chicago, and the room emptied out, and he was in there with Kenny O'Donnell, the campaign manager, and went to the bathroom. And Dad saw the opportunity and asked his brother-in-law to make the phone call, and Jack said, I don't have her number. He pulls the number out, dials it on the hotel phone, talk for less than a minute, hang up the phone. Kenny O'Donnell comes out, asks what happened, and all hell broke loose. Civil rights unit closed. They thought that he had lost the campaign. A couple of days later, Daddy King, who was a Republican, this is Martin Luther King Sr., who was a Republican and had already endorsed Richard Nixon, came out and changed his endorsement and said something to the effect that if Jack Kennedy had the courage to wipe away the tears from Coretta Scott King, he was going to throw his votes behind Senator Kennedy. Ralph David Abernathy, a couple days later, did the same thing. And if you look at the vote totals in that election, the African American votes went up to such a degree that most people think that's what got Jack Kennedy elected president. And I think that my father didn't see that as a political move, but as a move to try to set the tone aright between African Americans and white people in this country, that it was a small step in the right direction. And you see that in the case of my mother as well. She started Special Olympics in 1968, a couple of weeks after her brother Bobby had been killed, and been told by all the experts that people that were at that point called retards or retarded could never play sports together, right? And she knew that her sister, who had some developmental differences, could play sports, and she created Special Olympics in Chicago, Soldier Field, an almost deserted field with a couple of athletes from America and some from Canada. And at the end of that, Dick Daley, who was then mayor of Chicago, turned to her and said, Eunice, the world will never be the same. And through that sports program, we've seen changes here in America and around the world on behalf of people with developmental disabilities. They live on their own, they're married, they have jobs. These all kind of come from a number of different ripples of hope, the biggest of which I would argue is Special Olympics. She was told not to do it, it wouldn't work, but she did it. And you think around, you see these examples of Head Start and legal services that my father started under President Johnson. Imagine giving poor people money so their kids could get a Head Start and go to school, go to kindergarten prepared, ready to learn. Going to schools that were segregated, to go to universities that were segregated. I mean, talk about the audacity of hope. Legal services giving money to poor people, or the lawyers, so that they could represent poor people. Equal justice in America. These were all cases of where people were trying to do something new, to set things aright, as we're trying to do here in Virginia, to try to change the system. They were ridiculed and ostracized, but they persevered, as father said, because they had courage. And they knew that they weren't doing it for their own personal gain, their own fortune, but that they were trying to heed the gospel's call to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to shelter the homeless, to, as the Jews call it, tikkun olam, to repair the world. What Muslims say Ishla is to improve or to better the world, to make peace. So I bet you're thinking I'm talking too long. And you're probably thinking what these stories about Boys Town or Special Olympics or Martin Luther King or Head Start or legal services have to do with us here today, trying to create change in Virginia so that all can flourish, as your mission statement says. But each of these people, Father Flanagan, my mom, my dad, they were all advocates, just like you and I are. They all wanted to take action to try to make things right, to change the situation. They stood up to the political establishment, and they fought for the voiceless, for the homeless, and the powerless. Whether it was the Omaha City Council, whether it was the Nebraska legislature, whether it was President Roosevelt, whether it was President Johnson, or even President Kennedy, or Congress, or so-called experts in the field of mental retardation. These people were just like you and me in that they were advocates and they wanted to set things right. They told the powers that be what they wanted, and they fought for it. I honestly believe that Father Flanagan had no idea he was going to create Boys Town when he started that little building, that little housing structure in downtown Omaha, and that he would become a most powerful voice for poor kids, that he would have to go and borrow money from a Jewish man. I don't think my dad believed that he was going to make that phone call to Coretta Scott King and change the voting patterns of African Americans and change the voting patterns for the next 50 years. But he took action, call was made, and the rest is history. I don't think my mother ever dreamed that there'd be a worldwide movement called Special Olympics when she looked around an empty soldiers field and started the Special Olympics. It's hard to take that first step, right? People are going to tell you that you're wrong. You may be ridiculed. You may be told it's not going to make any difference at all. But don't listen to them. Do it. Take that first step. And if it only makes a small difference, it makes a difference. And I think when I look back at those three folks and the people that I admired most is that they actually loved their work. They were joy-filled. They weren't happy every day. Father Creedon can tell you that. But there's a difference between happiness and joy, right? I think they knew that they were fighting for a higher goal, and that gave them joy even when they were not happy and when things didn't go their way. And all of you, I would say, if you do this work and you actually ask for what you want and you push elected leaders for it, and it's for people, whether it's TANF, whether it's early education, whatever the case may be, your work will be filled with joy. I don't think my folks ever thought they were going to work. They thought they were going out to do God's will, and that gave them incredible joy. You're not going to make millions of dollars doing it. You're not going to be famous. You're not going to be on the front page of the Washington Post. But you're going to be a change maker on a daily basis. And what's more exciting than that? You know, companies like Blockbuster and Kodak are going to come and go. Netflix and even Apple, they're going to come and go inevitably. Change is inevitable, but change agents like each of you here in this room, people who persevere with joy, who focus on helping people, you're going to succeed. It's not going to be easy, but you're going to succeed. So let me leave you with this last quote from my dad, which was said in the early part of 1968, which was a tough time for this country as well. And he said at the University of Notre Dame, quote, "We need to make a national examination of conscience." Why do we need a national examination of conscience? Because suddenly we Americans seem to be panicking. It's time to stop moaning and wringing our hands. It's true, the country is in a crisis, but we've always been in a crisis. And we ought to thank God we are, because then we will always have something to test us, like a piece of steel that stays strong, precisely because it is enduring great pressure. There's a lot of pressure out there. There's a lot of tests. Some people see inevitable change in these crises as insurmountable, but change makers like you all see it as an opportunity to help others. I'm honored and proud to be in a room of folks that remind me of my parents who are going to go out and make change. Thanks so much for having me.